In the winter of 1379, deep beneath a cold castle in northern France, a young woman named Eleanor stood trembling in a stone cellar. She heard masons working just outside, and then she realized the terrifying truth. They weren't repairing the castle. They were building a wall to seal the cellar door. They were burying her alive. All because of an accusation she swore was false. Welcome to the brutal reality of medieval women, where a husband's word was law and jealousy could become the most agonizing death sentence. In the winter of 1379, a woman named Eleanor stood alone in a stone cell deep beneath a castle in northern France, listening to the sound of masons working above her. She had been 23 years old when they brought her here 6 days ago. She had been a nobleman's wife, educated, refined, accused of something she swore she had never done. For 6 days, she had heard the sounds of construction hammering, scraping the voices of men working. On the 7th day, the sounds stopped. The door to her cell opened, and the masons entered carrying buckets of mortar and stones. Eleanor asked them what they were doing. They would not answer. They began building a wall across the opening of her cell, sealing her inside. Eleanor screamed. She begged them to stop. She pleaded to speak to someone, anyone, to explain that this was a mistake, that she was innocent. The masons worked in silence, laying stone upon stone, mixing mortar, building the wall higher. As the wall rose to chest height, Eleanor could still see out into the corridor. She saw the castle steward watching from a distance. She called to him, reminded him that she had known him since childhood, begged him to stop this. He turned and walked away. The wall continued to rise. When it reached Eleanor's shoulders, she realized what was happening. They were sealing her in. They were burying her alive in this cell beneath the castle. She would die here in the darkness, slowly, alone, and no one would stop it because her husband had accused her of adultery. And in medieval Europe, a husband's word was law. But before I tell you what happened to Eleanor in that sealed cell, before I tell you whether she survived or how long she lasted before I reveal the full horror of what medieval society did to women accused of adultery, I need to tell you about other women whose fates were just as terrible, whose stories reveal a system of punishment so brutal that it's almost impossible to believe it happened in Christian Europe. Because what happened to Eleanor was not unique. It was one method among dozens that medieval courts and communities used to destroy women accused of betraying their husbands. And by the end of this video, when I tell you what ultimately happened to Eleanor in that cell, you will understand that medieval Europe's treatment of accused adulteresses was worse than execution, worse than torture, worse than anything most people can imagine. This is the story of the most horrific punishments for cheating wives in medieval Europe. And I need you to understand from the beginning that everything I describe is documented in historical records, in court documents, in church archives, in chronicles, written by medieval people themselves. These are not legends or exaggerations. These are real punishments that happened to real women, recorded by the very societies that carried them out. If you want to understand how entire civilizations can normalize systematic violence against women, how accusations become weapons more deadly than swords, how gender-based terror can be woven into the fabric of law and custom, then you need to watch this entire video. Now let me tell you about Marjgery, because her story shows you how these punishments actually worked in practice, and because what happened to her will help you understand what was waiting for Eleanor in that sealed cell. In the spring of 1342, a woman named Marjgery stood in the village square of a small town in Yorkshire, England, while the blacksmith heated an iron rod in his forge until it glowed orange-red with heat. Marjgery was 31 years old, married for 14 years to a wool merchant named Thomas, who traveled frequently for business. She had been accused of adultery with a young baker named William. The evidence was circumstantial at best, almost laughably thin. A neighbor claimed to have seen William entering Marjgery's home while Thomas was away on one of his business trips. Another neighbor said she had heard laughter coming from inside the house. That was it. That was the entire case against Marjgery. A man entered her home during daylight hours, possibly to deliver bread. Someone heard laughter. From this, an entire community concluded that Marjgery was an adulteress who deserved punishment. Marjgery had not been allowed to defend herself in any meaningful way. She had not been permitted to speak at the trial held by the local Lord's court. Her accuser was her husband, Thomas himself. And under medieval law throughout most of Europe, a husband's testimony about his wife's behavior carried absolute weight. His word was truth. His interpretation of events was reality. Thomas had found out about William's visits through neighborhood gossip that had reached him while he was conducting business in another town. A fellow merchant had mentioned with smirking sympathy that people back home were talking about Thomas's wife entertaining the baker while Thomas was away. Thomas had not witnessed any impropriety himself. He had no evidence beyond the gossip, but the damage to his honor, the public humiliation of being potentially cuckolded, the whispers and knowing looks from other men, these demanded action. His reputation as a man depended entirely on his ability to control his wife, to ensure her absolute fidelity, to punish her publicly and severely if she strayed, or even if she appeared to stray. In medieval society, a man who could not control his wife was not a man at all. He was a cuckold, a figure of mockery and contempt, someone who had failed at the most basic duty of manhood. Now Marjgery stood with her hands bound behind her back, while the entire village gathered to watch her punishment. The gathering was not optional. The Lord's bailiff had gone through the village that morning, announcing that all residents were required to attend the punishment of the adulterous Marjgery, wife of Thomas the wool merchant. Attendance was mandatory because these punishments were not just about punishing the individual. They were about teaching the entire community a lesson about reinforcing social order, about showing every wife what would happen if she stepped out of line, and showing every husband that the law supported his absolute authority. The blacksmith removed the glowing iron from the forge, holding it carefully with heavy tongs. It was a simple rod, about 6 inches long and an inch wide, with a flat end that had been carefully shaped into the letter A for adulteress. The shaping had been done the previous day, while Marjgery sat in a cell beneath the manor house, listening to the sound of metal being hammered, and knowing that iron was being prepared to mark her flesh permanently. Marjgery could feel the heat radiating from the metal as the blacksmith approached her, the rod glowing bright orange waves of heat, distorting the air around it. She tried to back away, an instinctive recoil from the approaching agony, but 2 men stepped forward and grabbed her arms, holding her firmly in place. One of them was her own cousin, a man she had known her entire life, but his face showed no sympathy, no doubt only a grim determination to do his duty as a member of the community, enforcing justice. The blacksmith positioned himself directly in front of Marjgery. He looked into her eyes for just a moment. Was that pity apology, or simply the cold efficiency of a craftsman about to perform a task? Then pressed the glowing iron against Marjgery's left cheek. The sizzle of burning flesh was audible across the entire square, a sound like meat being seared on a hot pan, sharp and stomach-turning. Marjgery screamed a sound of such pure, undiluted agony that it seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her throat, torn from her very soul. The scream echoed off the buildings surrounding the square, bouncing back and forth, filling the air with the sound of her suffering. The smell of burning flesh and hair filled the air, acrid and nauseating, making several people in the crowd turn away or cover their noses. But most watched with grim fascination, their faces showing a mixture of righteous satisfaction, vicarious horror, and perhaps relief that they were standing in the crowd rather than being held at the center of it. The blacksmith held the iron in place for several seconds that must have felt like hours to Marjgery, ensuring the brand would be deep enough to scar permanently, clear enough to be read easily, marking her forever as an adulteress. When he finally removed the iron, Marjgery collapsed to her knees, her legs no longer able to support her weight. She sobbed and gasped, her hands still bound behind her back, so she could not even touch her face or try to ease the burning pain. The letter A was burned into her left cheek, about 2 inches high. The flesh charred black in the center, with red, blistering skin around it. Blood mixed with clear fluid oozed from the wound. Everyone who saw her for the rest of her life would know immediately what she had done, or what she had been accused of doing. She would never be able to hide her shame. She would never be able to start over somewhere else where people did not know her history. The brand announced her disgrace to anyone who looked at her face. But the branding was only the beginning of Marjgery's punishment. And this is crucial to understand about medieval justice for accused adulteresses. The punishment was never just one thing. It was always multiple, always public, always designed to destroy the woman physically, socially, economically, and psychologically. The goal was not simply to punish the specific act of adultery, which in Marjgery's case had never even been proven to have occurred, but to utterly annihilate the woman as a person, to make her an example so terrifying that every other woman in the community would be paralyzed with fear at the mere thought of stepping out of line. After the branding, Marjgery was barely conscious from pain and shock. The agony radiating from her cheek was so intense that it seemed to fill her entire head, making it difficult to think or see or process what was happening around her. The flesh of her cheek was charred black in the center, where the metal had pressed longest, already beginning to blister and swell. Blood mixed with clear fluid oozed from the wound, running down her jaw and dripping onto her dress. The pain was so overwhelming that it dominated every sense, every thought, every moment of existence. But the crowd was not satisfied. They had come for a spectacle, for justice, for entertainment that broke up the monotony of medieval village life. The spectacle had to continue. Under English common law and local custom that had been practiced for generations, a woman convicted of adultery faced multiple forms of punishment, each one designed to humiliate her thoroughly and to ensure that she would serve as a warning to every other woman in the community. Marjgery was dragged across the square, her feet barely able to move, leaving tracks in the dirt where she stumbled. The men hauling her showed no gentleness, no consideration for her pain. She was pulled to the pillory that stood permanently erected in the center of the square, a wooden framework with holes for the head and hands that had been built decades ago and had held countless people over the years. The wood stained dark from weather and from the bodily fluids of those who had been locked in it. The pillory was designed not just to hold the condemned, but to cause them physical suffering. It forced the person into an extremely uncomfortable bent-over position that made breathing difficult and caused severe back and neck pain within minutes. The hole for the neck was deliberately small, pressing against the throat, and the holes for the wrists were positioned so that the arms were stretched uncomfortably. Standing in the pillory for even an hour was agonizing. Standing for 3 hours, as Marjgery would be required to do, was a form of torture in itself. Marjgery's neck and wrists were locked into the device, the wooden bars closed and secured with an iron pin. She was forced to stand bent over at an unnatural angle, her back already beginning to ache. Her neck compressed by the wooden collar. A sign was hung around her neck, suspended from a rope, so it dangled against her chest, reading in large letters painted in black, "Adulteress and Whore." The words could be read from across the square, ensuring that anyone who happened to pass by would understand exactly what crime this woman had committed and what category of person she was. Then the real humiliation began. The part that would be seared into Marjgery's memory forever. The part that would destroy something essential in her, even if her body survived. In medieval Europe, public punishment was participatory. The crowd was not just supposed to watch passively like modern observers at a criminal proceeding. They were expected to join in actively to add their own expressions of moral outrage to the official punishment to demonstrate their own virtue and their own adherence to community values by attacking the condemned. For Marjgery, this meant being pelted with whatever refuse the crowd could find while she was locked in the pillory, unable to defend herself, unable to dodge or escape, forced to stand there and endure whatever they chose to throw at her. The first projectile was a rotten cabbage thrown by an old woman who lived 3 houses down from Marjgery and who had always watched her with suspicious eyes. The cabbage hit Marjgery in the face, spattering across the fresh brand on her cheek and making her scream again from the renewed agony. The impact drove bits of rotten vegetable into the burn wound, contaminating it with bacteria that would cause a severe infection within hours. Then came a barrage of refuse, as if Marjgery's scream had been a signal that opened the floodgates. Spoiled eggs that had been saved specifically for this purpose. The contents rotten and sulfurous, breaking against her head and running down her face and into her hair. Rotten tomatoes that exploded on impact, covering her in red pulp. The contents of chamber pots thrown from close range by people who aimed carefully to ensure the waste splashed across her face and body. Mud mixed with horse manure scooped from the streets where horses and oxen had been driven. Small stones not large enough to cause serious injury. The authorities did not want to kill her after all, but large enough to hurt when they struck her head and shoulders. Opening small cuts that bled down her neck. The crowd jeered and shouted insults with each throw. Each person trying to voice the cleverest or most cutting remark. Faithless woman, betrayer of your husband, devil's bride, corrupted flesh, Jezebel. The insults were as much a part of the punishment as the physical assault designed to destroy any remaining sense of dignity or self-worth. Marjgery was not just being hurt physically. She was being told again and again by everyone she knew, by her neighbors and acquaintances, and people she had lived among her entire life, that she was worthless, that she was less than human, that she deserved this treatment, that she had brought this suffering upon herself through her own wickedness. Children were specifically encouraged to participate their parents, lifting them up to get better angles for throwing or handing them particularly disgusting items to throw at the woman in the pillory. Young boys, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, competed with each other to see who could hit Marjgery with the most disgusting projectiles, laughing and celebrating each successful throw as if it were a game. Learning through direct participation that this was proper treatment for women who violated their marriage vows. Young girls watched from the edges of the crowd, their mothers holding their hands or standing behind them with hands on their shoulders. All of them learning what would happen if they ever strayed from absolute obedience to their future husbands. Internalizing the message that female virtue must be guarded at all costs, because the punishment for failure was complete social destruction. Marjgery stood in the pillory for 3 full hours, from mid-morning until early afternoon, the sun climbing higher in the sky and heating the square, making the smell of the refuse covering her even more intense. By the end, she was covered in filth, from head to foot, barely recognizable as a human being. Her hair was matted with rotten eggs and excrement. Her dress, which had been cleaned that morning, was soaked with every kind of refuse the village could produce. She was bleeding from where stones had cut her scalp and face. Her neck and back were in agony from being held in the unnatural position for so long. She could barely stand, her legs shaking from exhaustion and pain, only the wooden collar around her neck keeping her from collapsing. The branded cheek was severely infected from the contamination of all the refuse thrown at her. The flesh had swollen to nearly twice its normal size, turning dark purple and green around the edges of the burn. The infection was spreading into the surrounding tissue, creating an abscess that would cause Marjgery intense pain for weeks, and that might, if she was very unlucky, spread to her bloodstream and kill her from sepsis. When she was finally released from the pillory, the bailiff removing the iron pin and lifting the wooden bars, Marjgery collapsed immediately to the muddy ground. She fell forward, landing face first in the accumulated filth that surrounded the pillory, too weak to catch herself or control her fall. She lay there, unable to move, barely conscious, breathing in shallow gasps. The crowd began to disperse. Having gotten the entertainment, they came for their duty to community justice. Fulfilled, heading home to eat dinner and discuss what they had witnessed. But wait, because Marjgery's punishment still was not finished. You might think that after being branded and spending 3 hours in the pillory, being pelted with refuse by the entire village, Marjgery had suffered enough to satisfy the requirements of medieval justice. But you would be wrong. Medieval justice operated on multiple principles that demanded more. The principle that shame must be made visible in multiple ways, not just one. The principle that the entire community must participate in marking and ostracizing the transgressor through various rituals that followed traditional patterns. The principle that punishment must be memorable enough to serve as a deterrent for years or even decades, that people should be able to say, "Remember what happened to Marjgery," and have everyone immediately understand the consequences of accused adultery. What came next would ensure that Marjgery's disgrace followed her for every remaining day of her life, and that everyone who witnessed it would never forget the consequences of being accused of betraying her husband. The next morning, Marjgery was dragged from the cell, where she had spent the night lying on cold stone, still covered in the dried filth from the previous day. The wound on her face swollen and hot with infection, her entire body aching from the abuse it had endured. She was taken by the town constable, pulled by ropes tied around her wrists, because she could barely walk on her own to the river that ran along the edge of the village. A crowd was already gathering there. Word having spread that the adulteress was to undergo the ducking, the traditional water punishment for women who had strayed from virtue. At the river's edge stood a device called a ducking stool, a chair made of rough wood and iron attached to a long wooden beam that could be operated like a lever to plunge the occupant repeatedly into the water. Ducking stools were used throughout medieval England and parts of continental Europe primarily for punishing women. Scolds, gossips, brewers accused of selling bad ale, and most commonly women accused of moral offenses like adultery. The devices were permanent fixtures in many towns, maintained at public expense, just like the pillories and the gallows, standing as constant reminders of what could happen to women who violated community norms. The official justification for ducking was that the cold water would cool the hot passions that led women to sin. That immersion in the purifying element would cleanse them of their corruption and restore them to virtue. This explanation was written into legal codes and church teachings, giving the punishment an air of medical and spiritual legitimacy. The real purpose, which everyone understood but rarely stated openly, was humiliation and physical torment disguised as correction and purification. Another method of breaking the condemned woman physically and psychologically while entertaining the crowd. Marjgery was dragged to the ducking stool and forced into the chair. Her arms were bound to the armrests with leather straps pulled tight enough to cut into her skin. Her body was secured to the peak of the chair with a rope around her waist tied so she could not escape or even struggle effectively. The chair was designed to prevent the occupant from moving from protecting themselves in any way from doing anything but enduring whatever was done to them. The operator of the ducking stool, usually a town official or his assistant, who was paid a small fee for this service, pulled a lever. The long beam, working like a seesaw with the chair attached to one end, swung out over the river, carrying Marjgery with it. She had just enough time to draw breath and realize what was about to happen before the operator released the lever and the chair plunged down into the water. The shock of the cold was overwhelming, like being struck by a physical blow. It was early spring, March or early April, and the river was fed by snow melt from the hills above the village, making the water brutally cold, perhaps just above freezing. The sudden immersion made Marjgery gasp involuntarily, a reflex she could not control, and she inhaled water into her lungs. She choked and struggled against her bonds, thrashing helplessly in the chair, unable to understand what was happening or how to protect herself. Her lungs burned, her vision darkened at the edges. She was certain she was drowning, that this was how she would die, trapped underwater in this chair, that they had decided to execute her after all. Just as her consciousness was beginning to fade, just as she was on the verge of passing out from lack of oxygen, the operator pulled the lever again, and the beam raised her out of the water. Marjgery broke the surface, coughing and gasping. Water streaming from her hair, and clothes, her body shaking violently from the cold. She vomited up the water she had inhaled, choking and retching her throat raw, her chest heaving as she tried to draw a breath. But she was given only seconds to catch her breath. Just enough time for the crowd to see her face, to see her terror and suffering before the operator released the lever and she plunged underwater again and again and again. The ducking continued for 20 plunges, each one counted aloud by the crowd who had gathered on the riverbank and on the bridge above, chanting the numbers in unison like spectators at some grotesque sporting event. 1, 2, 3. Each time Marjgery went under, she was held there for longer periods. The operator carefully calibrating how long he could keep her submerged without actually killing her, walking the line between punishment and execution. Each time she came up, she was gasping and choking more desperately, coughing up water, her body shaking so violently from cold and terror that the chair rattled against the beam. By the 10th ducking, Marjgery was no longer struggling. She hung limp in the chair between immersions, barely conscious, water pouring from her mouth and nose, with each raising her head, lolling forward. Her lips had turned blue from cold. Her skin had taken on a grayish cast. She looked more like a corpse than a living person. By the 15th ducking, she was no longer making any sound when she came up from the water, just gasping weakly and shaking. Her eyes were unfocused, rolled back in her head. Some in the crowd began to murmur that perhaps this was enough, that perhaps they were going to kill her, that perhaps the punishment was going too far. But the operator continued following the sentence that had been pronounced, the traditional 20 duckings for an adulteress. By the 20th and final ducking, Marjgery appeared more dead than alive. Her skin was blue from cold and lack of oxygen. Her breathing was shallow and labored, barely perceptible. The violent shaking had stopped, replaced by occasional twitches that might have been voluntary movement or might have been death spasms. She was pulled from the stool and laid on the riverbank, like a piece of discarded clothing water pouring from her lungs, as she was positioned on her side by rough hands that cared nothing for her comfort. The constable kicked her roughly in the ribs to see if she was still alive. She moaned weakly, a sound more animal than human, confirming that she had survived. This was considered a successful punishment, severe enough to be memorable, to provide a spectacle, to satisfy the community's demand for justice, but not fatal. Dead women could not serve as ongoing examples of what happened to adulteresses. Dead women could not walk through the village with their brands visible, reminding everyone of the consequences of straying. Marjgery needed to survive so she could continue to be punished every day by her very existence. The infection in Marjgery's branded cheek had worsened dramatically from immersion in the contaminated river water. Medieval rivers were open sewers where all the waste of human civilization accumulated. They were filled with human and animal waste, with the chemicals and byproducts from leather workers who treated hides and tanning pits that drained into the river, with blood and offal from butchers who slaughtered animals on the riverbank and threw the waste into the water with all manner of refuse and contamination. The bacteria-laden water had infected the burn wound, severely causing the flesh to swell massively, turning it dark purple and green with streaks of red spreading out across her cheek and jaw that indicated blood poisoning. Marjgery developed a high fever that night, her body's attempt to fight the multiple infections ravaging her system. She spent the next week in bed in a room provided by the church, not out of mercy, but because if she died on the streets, it would create a disposal problem, delirious and close to death. Her body fighting infections on multiple fronts, she survived, but the illness and the damage from the punishments changed her fundamentally. And here's what makes Marjgery's story even more tragic, even more of an indictment of the entire system. William the baker, when questioned under threat of his own punishment if he was found to have committed adultery with a married woman, testified that he had only delivered bread to Marjgery's home on the days in question. He said he had entered because Marjgery was counting out coins to pay him for previous deliveries, that the interaction had lasted perhaps 5 minutes while he waited for payment, and then left. He testified that nothing improper had occurred, that he had never touched Marjgery, had never spoken to her about anything except bread and payment, that the conversations had been brief and entirely proper. But once accused by her husband, Marjgery had no effective way to defend herself against the charge. Medieval law in most of Europe operated on assumptions that made defense nearly impossible for accused women. The assumption that a husband's honor was too important to be questioned without overwhelming evidence. The assumption that protecting male reputation was more important than establishing truth. The assumption that it was better to punish a possibly innocent woman than to allow a guilty one to escape, or to embarrass a husband by suggesting his accusation might be false. The assumption that women were naturally deceptive and prone to lying about their own behavior, so their testimony about their innocence could not be trusted. The system was designed to make defense nearly impossible once an accusation was made. In most medieval courts, women could not testify on their own behalf in cases involving their own supposed moral failings. This legal principle, written into law codes throughout Christian Europe, held that a woman's testimony about her own virtue was inherently unreliable because women were believed to be naturally inclined to deception in order to protect themselves. The only testimony that mattered was from the accuser, the husband, and from witnesses who claimed to have seen suspicious behavior. The standard of proof was not beyond reasonable doubt in the modern sense, but simply suspicion based on appearance of impropriety. This meant that a woman could be convicted and brutally punished based solely on having been seen talking to a man who was not her husband, on having smiled at someone, on having been insufficiently modest in her dress or behavior, on having failed to immediately report to her husband every interaction with another male. The system ensured that accusations almost inevitably led to convictions, and that convictions led to devastating punishments. The punishments destroyed not just the woman's body, but her entire social existence. Marjgery's husband Thomas divorced her through the ecclesiastical courts on grounds of adultery, which was automatically granted given Marjgery's conviction in the secular court. The divorce left Marjgery with no support, no property, and no legal protection. Under medieval law, throughout most of Europe, when a marriage was dissolved due to the wife's adultery, the husband kept all marital property. This included not just property the couple had acquired during the marriage, but even the dowry that Marjgery's family had provided when she married, which was supposed to be her security. Thomas took everything: the house, the furnishings, the money, the goods. Marjgery was left literally with nothing except the filthy dress she had been wearing during her punishments. She could not work in any respectable trade. No one would hire a woman branded on the face as an adulteress. The brand was specifically designed to make her unemployable, to ensure she could never rebuild a normal life. She could not work as a servant in any respectable household because her presence would corrupt the moral atmosphere. Or so people believed. Morality was thought to be contagious in medieval society, both virtue and vice spreading from person to person through association. A branded adulteress in a household would contaminate the virtue of the other servants. Or so the reasoning went. She could not work with other women in textile production, the most common form of women's work, because the other women refused to associate with her, claiming she would corrupt them, or that they could not be seen associating with such a woman without damaging their own reputations. The only work available to her was the most degrading and dangerous, collecting refuse from the streets, cleaning latrines, perhaps selling her body, though even in that profession her brand made her less desirable than unmarked women. The irony was not lost on anyone, least of all Marjgery herself. She had been branded as a whore for allegedly committing adultery. Now the only way she could survive was to actually become what she had been falsely accused of being. She could not attend church without people whispering and pointing. The priest would not allow her to take communion or to participate in any of the sacraments, marking her as outside the community of Christian souls. She was not quite formally excommunicated, but she was effectively excluded from full participation in Christian religious life, which in medieval Europe meant she was excluded from the most important aspects of community belonging. Children would follow her in the streets chanting, "Adulteress, adulteress," in mocking sing-song voices, throwing small stones or mud at her. Adults would spit at her when she passed, or throw things repeating the violence of her public punishment on a smaller scale every day. She was effectively exiled while remaining physically in the same town, isolated among people she had known her entire life. After 6 months of this existence, of being unable to find work, of surviving on scraps and occasional coins from people who took pity on her, of sleeping in abandoned buildings or under hedges because no one would rent her a room, Marjgery left the village. She hoped that perhaps in another place where no one knew her history, where no one had witnessed her punishments, she might be able to start over, to find some kind of life. But the brand on her face made this impossible. The brand was specifically designed to be permanent, to be immediately recognizable, to announce to anyone who saw it exactly what crime the bearer had committed. In every town and village Marjory entered, people saw the A burned into her cheek and knew immediately what it meant. The meanings of brands were standardized across much of Europe, a for adulteress T, for thief H, for heretic, and so on. The brands were designed to be a permanent mark that followed the criminal forever, preventing them from escaping their past and starting over. Marjory was driven away from town after town, sometimes with threats, sometimes with actual violence. In one village, men threw stones at her until she fled. In another, she was dragged before the local magistrate, who ordered her to leave immediately on pain of being whipped. In a third, women surrounded her and beat her with sticks, accusing her of trying to corrupt their community with her presence. She survived by begging on the roads between settlements, sleeping in ditches or abandoned buildings, eating whatever scraps she could find. She learned to approach people carefully. Her head down, her branded cheek turned away, trying to get them to give her something before they saw the mark and understood what she was. Sometimes this worked. Sometimes she could beg a piece of bread or a few coins before people noticed. More often, they saw the brand immediately and drove her away. The chronic illness from her punishments weakened her progressively. The repeated near drownings had caused permanent damage to her lungs, scarring the tissue and reducing her ability to breathe properly. She developed a persistent cough that worsened with each passing month, especially in cold or damp weather. She would cough until she vomited, until blood came up with the phlegm. Her body trying desperately to clear lungs that would never fully heal. The infection from the brand had spread through the left side of her face, causing permanent damage to nerves and tissue. She was left with chronic pain that never fully went away, a constant aching and burning sensation in her cheek and jaw. The left side of her face was partially paralyzed, making it difficult to eat or speak clearly. The scarring pulled her mouth into a permanent grimace on that side. 2 years after her conviction, in the winter of 1344, Marjory died at age 33. Her body was found in a ditch beside a road between two small villages, frozen and partially covered with snow. She had been dead for several days before anyone found her. The local authorities in the nearest village were notified. They sent men to collect the body, which they buried in an unmarked grave in unconsecrated ground at the edge of the churchyard, the area reserved for criminals, suicides, and others deemed unworthy of proper Christian burial. Her death was recorded in the parish register as simply an adulterous woman found dead on the roadside, buried outside the churchyard wall. No name, no mention of family, no suggestion that she had ever been a person with a life and identity beyond her crime. This was Marjory's end. Accused based on thin evidence, convicted in a court where she could not defend herself. Brutally punished in ways designed to destroy her, completely divorced and left destitute, driven from place to place, dying alone in a ditch, and buried without ceremony in an unmarked grave. And her story was not unusual. This was normal. This was what happened to thousands of women throughout medieval Europe who were accused of adultery. But what I haven't told you yet, what you need to understand before we return to Eleanor in her sealed cell, is that Marjory's punishment was actually one of the milder forms that medieval society used for accused adulteresses. She survived her punishments, at least initially. She lived for 2 more years. Some women were not so lucky. Some women faced fate so much worse that Marjory's suffering seems almost bearable by comparison. Now let me tell you about Isabella, because Isabella's story will show you how noble women faced different but equally terrible punishments. And because Isabella's fate is part of understanding what was waiting for Eleanor in that cell beneath the castle. Isabella was 24 years old in the year 1326, from a respected noble family in Burgundy. Her marriage had been arranged when she was 14 to Baron Geoffrey de Montfort, a wealthy landowner who was 42 at the time of the marriage and who needed heirs to continue his line. The marriage was purely political and economic, a union of two powerful families and their estates, arranged by Isabella's father and Geoffrey without any consideration of whether the 14-year-old Isabella and the middle-aged Geoffrey would be compatible, or whether Isabella had any say in the matter. In medieval noble society, daughters were assets to be traded, and their preferences were irrelevant. Geoffrey was not a kind husband. He was not particularly cruel by the standards of his class and time, but he was cold, distant, focused primarily on his estates and his political position at the Burgundian court. He spent most of his time managing his lands, hunting with his peers, and attending on the Duke of Burgundy. Isabella lived in Geoffrey's castle, with minimal companionship, except for servants and Geoffrey's household staff. She was isolated, lonely, trapped in a life she had not chosen with a man she barely knew, and who showed her little affection or attention. Geoffrey's household chaplain was a young priest named Pierre, who had been educated at the University of Paris, one of the great centers of learning in medieval Europe. Pierre was intelligent, well-read, perhaps 27 years old when he came to serve in Geoffrey's household. When Pierre arrived at the castle to serve as chaplain, Isabella was 18 and desperately lonely. She had been married for 4 years, had produced no children despite Geoffrey's periodic attention, which came irregularly and without affection, and spent her days with almost no one to talk to, except servants who could not speak to her as equals because of the vast social distance between a baron's wife and household staff. Isabella and Pierre began having conversations in the castle library, where Geoffrey kept his small collection of books, perhaps 24 volumes, which was actually quite a substantial library for a provincial noble. They discussed theology, philosophy, the classical texts that Pierre had studied at university. They talked about Aristotle and Augustine, about whether the world was eternal or created, about the nature of the soul, about questions that had never occurred to Isabella before, because no one had ever suggested to her that women were capable of thinking about such things. For Isabella, who had received only the most minimal education before marriage, basic reading in French and Latin, elementary religious instruction training in household management, and needlework. These conversations were a revelation, an opening into a world of ideas she had never known existed. For Pierre, Isabella was an intelligent and sympathetic listener in a world where most nobility treated priests as little more than servants. Their friendship was based on genuine intellectual companionship and mutual respect, something rare in medieval society, where most relationships were defined by hierarchy and social utility. The friendship was completely innocent, at least initially. They never touched. They never spoke of anything improper. Their conversations were always in public spaces: the library, the chapel, the castle, garden where servants were present and could observe them. They discussed ideas, not feelings, philosophy, not attraction. But the friendship looked suspicious to others in the household who observed them spending hours together talking with obvious enthusiasm and enjoyment. Isabella laughing at Pierre's observations in a way she never laughed with Geoffrey. A servant perhaps hoping to gain favor with Geoffrey, or perhaps genuinely believing something improper was occurring, or perhaps simply enjoying the chance to create drama, reported to Geoffrey that his wife spent inappropriate amounts of time alone with the chaplain. The word alone was technically false. Servants were present. But in the medieval mind, a married woman spending extended time with a man who was not her husband in any context was suspicious. Geoffrey's adult son from his first marriage, a man named Robert, who was actually older than Isabella and who stood to inherit Geoffrey's entire estate unless Isabella bore sons who would take precedence, seized on this report with enthusiasm. Robert had resented Isabella from the moment she married his father. He saw her as a threat to his inheritance, as a young woman, who might yet bear sons who would displace him from his expected position. Now he had an opportunity to destroy her, to eliminate the threat she represented by convincing his father that Isabella was an adulteress who needed to be removed. Robert went to Geoffrey and told him that rumors were circulating among the servants and even among Geoffrey's noble peers that Isabella and Pierre were conducting an affair that Geoffrey was being made a fool of in his own castle, that whispers and knowing looks followed Geoffrey wherever he went, that his honor as a lord and husband demanded immediate and decisive action to stop the gossip and restore his reputation. Geoffrey confronted Isabella in a rage, bursting into her chambers late one evening with Robert following behind him. Isabella, confused and frightened by her husband's unusual anger. Geoffrey was normally cold, but controlled, insisted that her relationship with Pierre was completely chaste, that they had only discussed books and ideas, that nothing improper had ever occurred, that she had always behaved with complete propriety. Geoffrey did not believe her. Or perhaps he did believe her, but chose to act as if he did not, because accusing her of adultery served his purposes in multiple ways. It gave him the excuse to get rid of a wife who had failed to produce the heir he wanted after 10 years of marriage. It allowed him to reclaim the substantial dowry Isabella's family had provided, which would revert to Geoffrey if the marriage was dissolved due to Isabella's fault. It demonstrated his authority and decisiveness to his peers, and it protected his honor by showing that he was man enough to control his household and punish an errant wife. But here's where the story reveals how trapped noble women were in medieval society. How they faced different but equally terrible punishments than common women. Geoffrey could not simply brand Isabella or subject her to the brutal public punishments used on women like Marjgery. Isabella's family was too powerful, connected to other noble houses throughout Burgundy and beyond. If Geoffrey openly harmed Isabella in ways that left visible scars, or that resulted in her death, it would create a blood feud with her relatives, potentially leading to private war between the families, to raids on each other's estates, to a cycle of violence and revenge that could continue for generations. Medieval nobility had to be careful about how they dealt with each other's family members, because violence against one member of a noble family could trigger obligations of revenge that destroyed the delicate web of alliances and marriages that held noble society together. So Geoffrey chose a different method, one that was legal throughout Christian Europe, religiously sanctioned by the Church, and that would permanently remove Isabella from his life, while avoiding direct violence that might trigger retaliation from her family. He announced that Isabella would be sent to a convent for spiritual correction and penance. This sounds relatively benign to modern ears, almost gentle, a woman going to live with nuns to pray and find peace. But the reality was far darker. Isabella was not being given a choice to take vows and become a nun, which would have been a respectable path for a noble woman. She was being forcibly imprisoned in a convent for the rest of her life, without her consent, separated from the world against her will, her property and inheritance forfeited to Geoffrey. Her legal existence effectively ended, and the convent chosen was not a comfortable establishment for noble daughters, but a harsh penitentiary specifically designed to house women whose families wanted them disappeared. The convent was in a remote area of the Alps, accessible only by difficult mountain paths, isolated from other settlements, a place where women could be locked away and forgotten. It was known throughout the region for its harsh discipline and its strict enclosure for accepting women sent there for punishment, rather than vocation for asking no questions, as long as the family paid the substantial fees required for perpetual imprisonment. Isabella was taken there by armed guards in the middle of the night, roused from her bed without warning, not allowed to gather possessions or say goodbye to anyone. She was placed on a horse and led away from Geoffrey's castle under guard, traveling for weeks. Through countryside she had never seen sleeping at night in way stations, or rough inns, treated not as a noblewoman, but as a prisoner being transported to her place of confinement. Under feudal law throughout Europe, Geoffrey had absolute authority over his wife. She was his property, his to dispose of as he saw fit. The church, which normally protected women seeking sanctuary in convents, and which sometimes intervened in cases of obvious abuse, sided with the husband in cases of accused adultery. The theological reasoning was that adultery was such a serious sin, such a violation of the sacred marriage bond, that wives accused of it forfeited the church's protection and could be dealt with by their husbands as seemed appropriate. When Isabella arrived at the convent after the long journey, she was immediately processed according to the institution's procedures for unwilling penitents, procedures that had been refined over decades of accepting women sent there against their will. She was stripped of her noble clothing, the fine dresses made of wool and linen, the jewelry, the well-made shoes, all the markers of her status, and dressed in a coarse woolen habit that scratched her skin and provided minimal warmth in the cold mountain climate. Her long hair, which noble women traditionally wore in elaborate styles as a mark of status and femininity, was shaved completely bald as a traditional sign of penance and humiliation. The shaving was not done gently. A rough-handed nun used dull shears to hack away most of the hair, then scraped Isabella's scalp with a blade, nicking the skin in several places so that blood ran down her neck. Isabella wept during the shaving, not from physical pain, but from the violation of having this happen to her, from having her identity as a noblewoman quite literally cut away. She was told by the abbess, a woman who had spent 40 years in this convent, and who had overseen the imprisonment of dozens of women sent there for similar reasons, that she would spend the rest of her life here in prayer and fasting, atoning for her sin of adultery, even though Isabella continued to insist she had done nothing wrong. The abbess told Isabella coldly, her face showing no sympathy or doubt, "Your protests of innocence mean nothing here. Your husband has declared you an adulteress. He is your lord and master, given authority over you by God and by law. His word is truth. That is all the truth that matters in this place. You will confess your sin. You will do the penance prescribed for you, and you will spend your remaining days in prayer, begging God's forgiveness for your wickedness." The conditions of Isabella's confinement revealed that this was not about spiritual redemption or giving her a chance to reform her character. This was about destroying her, about burying her alive, where she could never trouble Geoffrey again. Isabella was locked in a cell barely 6 feet wide and 8 feet long, with stone walls and a stone floor, and a single small window set high in the wall that let in minimal light and no warmth. The window was barely a foot square, covered with iron bars positioned too high for Isabella to look out and see anything but a small patch of sky. The cell contained a wooden plank for a bed, with no mattress or blankets, just the hard wood. A bucket in the corner served as a latrine emptied once per day, and that was all. No chair, no table, no possessions of any kind. She was given one meal a day delivered through a slot in the door. The meal consisted of a piece of bread, sometimes a thin soup if she was lucky, and a cup of water. This was barely enough to sustain life, intentionally insufficient to keep her in a state of weakness and chronic hunger. The constant malnutrition would make her too weak to resist, too weak to cause trouble, slowly breaking her body down. Over the years, she was allowed out of her cell only to attend religious services, which occurred 7 times throughout each day and night, following the traditional monastic schedule. Matins at midnight, lauds at dawn, prime at 6 in the morning, terce at 9, sext at noon, none at 3 in the afternoon, vespers at sunset, and compline before bed. These services, which would have been spiritually meaningful for someone who had chosen religious life, became a form of torture for Isabella, disrupting sleep continuously and ensuring constant exhaustion. During these services, Isabella was required to prostrate herself before the altar, lying face down on the cold stone floor, and confess her adultery publicly in front of the other nuns and the few other imprisoned women. She had to say in a loud voice, "I, Isabella, confess before God and this holy community that I am an adulteress, that I betrayed my husband, that I corrupted my soul through wickedness, that I deserve the punishment I have received." If she refused to speak these words, or if she tried to protest her innocence, she was beaten with rods by other nuns and denied even the minimal food she normally received until she complied. The worst part of her confinement was not the physical suffering, but the isolation. Isabella was forbidden from speaking to any of the other women in the convent. The few other imprisoned women sent there by their families for various supposed crimes were kept separated from each other and from the nuns who had taken vows by choice. Isabella could see other people during services, could hear their voices, but she was not allowed to communicate with them. If she tried to speak to anyone, she was beaten and returned to her cell for days without being allowed to leave even for services. She was not allowed to receive letters or visitors. She was cut off completely from the outside world, from her family, from anyone who had known her before. She had no way of knowing what was happening in the world beyond the convent walls. No way of knowing if Geoffrey had remarried, if her family had tried to intervene on her behalf, if Pierre the chaplain had been punished or had fled. She was buried alive in a stone cell in the mountains, forgotten by everyone except Geoffrey, who had the satisfaction of knowing his honor had been defended, and his problematic wife had been eliminated without the mess of execution. Isabella lived in that convent for 23 years before she died, at age 47, 23 years. More than 2 decades locked in a cell barely large enough to lie down in, fed 1 minimal meal per day, allowed to speak to no one. Cut off from every person she had ever known, with no hope of release, no possibility of appeal, no way to prove her innocence or to be heard by anyone who might help her. She never saw her family again. Her father had died within 5 years of her imprisonment, never knowing what had become of his daughter, beyond being told she was doing penance in a convent. Her younger siblings, who had been children when she was taken, grew up barely remembering her, told only that their sister had committed a terrible sin and was being punished for it. She never learned what happened to Pierre, the chaplain, who had been sent away from Geoffrey's service immediately after the accusation and who disappeared from the historical record. Probably fleeing to another region to avoid being charged as Isabella's accomplice, perhaps changing his name, perhaps abandoning the priesthood entirely to avoid questions about his past. She spent more than 2 decades confined to a few square feet of stone, praying the same prayers over and over, fasting, until her body was skeletal, insisting to God, if not to her captors, that she had done nothing wrong. The isolation and the harsh conditions broke her health progressively. She developed chronic illnesses from the cold and damp, from the malnutrition, from never seeing sunlight. Her teeth fell out from scurvy. Her joints became arthritic from sleeping on hard stone in the cold. Her mind began to deteriorate from the isolation and the monotony from having no mental stimulation beyond the same prayers repeated endlessly. When she died in 1349, her body was buried in an unmarked grave in the convent cemetery, a place where imprisoned women were buried without ceremony or remembrance. No one notified her family. Geoffrey, who had remarried within 2 years of sending Isabella away, and who had finally gotten the heir he wanted from his second wife, never knew or cared when Isabella died. Isabella's existence was simply erased as if she had never been born. 23 years for having conversations with a priest in her husband's library. 23 years for laughing at someone else's observations. 23 years for an accusation that was never proven and that was probably entirely false. Isabella's story shows how noble women, despite their wealth and status, were just as trapped as common women like Marjgery, just as vulnerable to accusations, just as powerless once a husband decided to act against them. But before Isabella was sent to the convent, there was a trial. And what happened during that trial reveals how thoroughly rigged the system was against accused women. Isabella's trial took place in Geoffrey's own baronial court, a court he controlled as the local feudal lord, with judges who were his vassals' men, who owed their positions and their livelihoods to Geoffrey's favor. The verdict was never in doubt. The trial was a formality designed to give legal cover to a decision Geoffrey had already made. Isabella was not allowed to speak in her own defense. This was not unusual. In most medieval courts throughout Europe, women were not permitted to testify in their own cases when accused of moral offenses. The legal reasoning was that women were naturally deceptive, that they could not be trusted to tell the truth about their own behavior, that their testimony would inevitably be lies designed to escape punishment. Only male testimony was considered reliable enough to base a verdict on. Geoffrey presented his evidence, such as it was the testimony of servants who claimed to have seen Isabella and Pierre alone together in the library on multiple occasions. Never mind that alone meant in a room where those same servants were present, where the door was open where anyone passing could see in. The testimony of Geoffrey's son Robert, who claimed that Isabella had confessed her affair to him in a moment of weakness, weeping, and begging him not to tell his father, a complete fabrication. But one that could not be challenged because Isabella was not allowed to speak. And Robert's testimony as a nobleman carried absolute weight. And Geoffrey's own testimony about his wife's suspicious behavior, her excessive interest in books and learning, her inappropriate familiarity with the chaplain, her failure to show proper wifely obedience and submission, the fact that Geoffrey had paid little attention to Isabella during their marriage, that he had left her isolated and lonely, that he had failed in his own marital duties. None of this was relevant. The only thing that mattered was whether Isabella had given Geoffrey cause to doubt her faithfulness. And his word on that question was final. But Isabella had one option, one slim hope of proving her innocence. She could submit to trial by ordeal, a practice that was still used in many parts of Europe in the early 14th century, even as the Church was beginning to officially discourage it. Trial by ordeal was based on the theological principle that God would intervene to protect the innocent. That the Almighty would not allow an innocent person to suffer harm during the ordeal. That the outcome would reveal divine judgment on the accused person's guilt or innocence. The most common ordeal for women accused of adultery was the hot iron ordeal. Isabella was told that if she was truly innocent, she could prove it by carrying a piece of heated iron for a specified distance, in her case, 9 paces. The iron would be heated until it glowed red. Isabella would be required to pick it up with her bare hands and carry it the required distance before dropping it. Her hands would then be bandaged carefully, and she would be locked in a room to await judgment. 3 days later, the bandages would be removed and her hands would be examined. If they had healed cleanly with no infection or signs of severe burning, God had shown her innocence. If they were badly burned, infected, or failed to heal properly, God had revealed her guilt. Isabella agreed to the ordeal, desperate to prove her innocence, willing to undergo any trial that might save her from being locked away forever. She was taken to the great hall of Geoffrey's castle, where the ordeal would be conducted before witnesses. A brazier had been set up, filled with hot coals. An iron rod, perhaps 18 inches long and an inch thick, was placed in the coals and left there for what seemed like hours, while the court assembled and priests said prayers asking God to reveal the truth. When the iron was finally removed from the brazier, it glowed bright red, almost white in the center, radiating heat that could be felt from several feet away. The priest in charge of the ordeal used heavy iron tongs to remove it from the coals and carried it carefully to where Isabella stood, her hands already trembling with fear. He told her to take the iron and carry it 9 paces, then drop it. 9 paces, he said, was the traditional distance for the ordeal based on ancient practice and religious significance, 9 being a sacred number associated with completion and perfection in medieval numerology. Isabella forced herself to reach out and grasp the iron rod, closing her fingers around the metal that was hot enough to boil water on contact. The pain was instantaneous and beyond anything she had ever experienced or imagined possible. It felt as though her hands were exploding, as though every nerve in her body had suddenly ignited. The smell of her own flesh burning filled her nostrils. A smell like meat cooking, but more horrible because it was her own body. She could hear the sizzle of her skin against the metal. She could see the smoke rising from where her palms touched the rod, but she forced herself to hold on to grip the iron despite every instinct screaming at her to drop it. She forced herself to take one step, then another, counting in her head, trying to focus on the numbers rather than the unimaginable pain. 1, 2, 3. Each step took what felt like an eternity. 4, 5, 6. Her vision was darkening at the edges. She could feel herself starting to faint from the pain. 7, 8, 9. She dropped the iron and collapsed immediately to the floor. Her hands held out in front of her, shaking violently. The flesh of her palms blackened and blistered, already swelling. The pain was so intense that she could not even scream, could not make any sound beyond small whimpering moans. She looked at her hands and could not recognize them as her own. The flesh was charred black in places, bright red, and already blistering in others. She could see exposed tissue beneath the burned skin. It was impossible to imagine how this level of damage could ever heal. Her hands were wrapped immediately in bandages that had been prepared for this purpose. Strips of linen that were supposedly clean, but that in reality contained all the bacteria present in medieval cloth. Isabella was taken to a locked room to await the judgment. For 3 days, she lay there in agony unlike anything she had thought possible. Her hands throbbed with pain that seemed to pulse through her entire body with each heartbeat. The burns swelled until her hands were twice their normal size, the bandages becoming tight and cutting off circulation. She could feel heat radiating from the wounds, could feel the infection spreading through her hands and up her arms. She was given no pain relief beyond occasional cups of wine that did almost nothing to dull the agony. Medieval medicine had little to offer for burns beyond washing them with wine or covering them with various ointments, none of which were effective against the severe burning and inevitable infection. Isabella spent 3 days in a state of constant agony, barely able to sleep, unable to think about anything except the pain in her hands. On the 3rd day, the bandages were removed in front of the assembled court. Everyone gathered to witness the judgment of God, to see what the ordeal had revealed about Isabella's guilt or innocence. The bandages were unwrapped slowly, each layer sticking to the burned flesh and having to be pulled away, causing Isabella to scream with renewed pain each time. When the final layer was removed, her hands were revealed to the court. Isabella's hands were a mass of burned, infected flesh. The skin was blackened and blistered, weeping fluid. The burns showed clear signs of severe infection, red streaks extending up her arms, the flesh around the burns swollen and discolored, a foul smell coming from the wounds. Under the rules of trial by ordeal, as they had been practiced for centuries throughout Christian Europe, this meant God had revealed her guilt. An innocent person's hands would have healed cleanly, would have shown signs of miraculous recovery. The severity of Isabella's burns and the obvious infection proved that she was guilty, that God had refused to protect her because she was an adulteress. Of course, the ordeal was impossible to pass under any circumstances, and this is what makes it so insidious as a tool of the legal system. Holding a red-hot iron for 9 paces would cause severe burns to anyone, regardless of guilt or innocence. The human body does not have any mechanism to protect against such extreme heat. The flesh will burn. The pain will be extreme. And given medieval medical knowledge, which had no understanding of bacteria or antiseptic technique, infection was virtually inevitable. Any burn severe enough to result from holding red-hot iron would become infected within 3 days when bandaged with medieval cloth and given no real treatment. But the ordeal provided religious and legal cover for what was really a predetermined outcome. Geoffrey wanted his wife gone. The trial by ordeal gave him a way to make that happen with the appearance of divine sanction, with God himself appearing to confirm that Isabella was guilty. How could her family object when God himself had revealed her guilt through the ordeal? How could anyone question Geoffrey's decision to punish her when the Almighty had made his judgment clear? Isabella was sent to the convent immediately after the ordeal, before her hands had any chance to heal while they were still infected and causing her excruciating pain. She made the long journey to the mountains, with her hands wrapped in dirty bandages, receiving no medical care, the infection spreading progressively. She spent the first months in the convent in constant agony as the burn slowly healed over the course of weeks, leaving her hands scarred and partially crippled for the rest of her life. Her fingers healed in curled positions, stiff and difficult to straighten, so that she could barely use her hands for even simple tasks. The scars were thick and ropey, pulling at the skin of her palms and fingers, and the pain never fully went away. For the rest of her 23 years in that cell, Her hands ached constantly, especially in cold weather, a permanent reminder of the injustice that had been done to her. Now let me tell you about Alice, because Alice's story reveals how women of the lower classes faced punishments that were, if anything, more brutal and more public than what noble women like Isabella endured. And Alice's fate will help you understand what was done to women throughout medieval society, from the highest nobility to the lowest peasants. In 1368, a woman named Alice lived in a small village in southern Germany, in a region where local customs regarding punishment for adultery were particularly brutal. Alice was 26 years old, married to a farmer named Hans for 8 years. They had 3 children, 2 daughters aged 6 and 4, and a son aged 2. Their life was hard, as life was for all peasant families, but it was manageable. They had a small plot of land that they worked paying a portion of their harvest to the local lord as rent. They had a modest house, a cow, some chickens. They were not wealthy, but they were surviving, which was all most people could hope for in medieval Europe. Then came the harvest season, when a traveling merchant named Friedrich passed through the village. Friedrich was in his 30s, charming and well-spoken, selling cloth and small luxuries to villagers who had grain or wool to trade after the harvest. He stayed at the village inn for several days while conducting his business with local farmers. Alice encountered Friedrich at the village well, where women gathered water every morning and evening. The well was the social center of the village, where women would meet, exchange news, and talk while drawing water for their households. Friedrich came to the well daily to get water for the inn. He was friendly and talkative, telling stories about his travels. He had been to cities, real cities, with stone buildings and markets and cathedrals, places Alice had never seen and could barely imagine. He told stories about Italian merchants trading in silks and spices from the Orient, about the Gothic cathedrals being built in France with their incredible height, and stained glass windows about the port cities where ships came from distant lands, bringing exotic goods. For Alice, whose entire life had been confined to this village in the surrounding fields, whose days were filled with back-breaking labor, and who rarely spoke to anyone except her family and a few neighbors. These stories were fascinating. They spoke briefly several times over the days Friedrich remained in the village. Friedrich was genuinely friendly, enjoying the chance to talk to someone who listened with such interest. Alice laughed at his stories and asked questions, enjoying the brief respite from the grinding hardship of her daily life. Their conversations were completely innocent. They were public, taking place at the village well in full view of anyone passing by. They were brief, lasting perhaps 5 or 10 minutes at most. Other women were always present. Friedrich and Alice never touched, never spoke of anything personal or inappropriate. But they were observed by other villagers, and in the close, suspicious world of a medieval village. Observations led to interpretations. Interpretations led to gossip, and gossip led to accusations. Women watching from their doorways or passing by on their way to the well noted that Alice seemed to enjoy talking to the merchant too much, that she smiled too much when speaking with him, that she laughed at his stories, that she asked questions about his travels, in a way that suggested she was interested in him as more than just a source of news, that she lingered at the well longer than necessary when Friedrich was there, drawing her water, slowly finding reasons to stay and listen. In the closed world of a medieval village, where everyone watched everyone else constantly, where social control depended on neighbors policing each other's behavior, where female virtue was monitored more carefully than any other aspect of life. These observations were enough to create a scandal. Women began to whisper to each other that Alice was behaving inappropriately with the traveling merchant, that she was showing too much interest in a man who was not her husband, that her behavior was unseemly for a married woman, that perhaps there was more going on than innocent conversation, though no one claimed to have seen anything actually improper. The assumption was that where there was smoke, there must be fire, that a woman who smiled too much must be guilty of more than smiling. When Friedrich left the village after completing his business, Alice thought nothing more of it. The brief break in her routine was over. She would return to her normal life of hard work and caring for her children and managing her household. But the rumors that had started during Friedrich's visit did not stop when he left. They continued to grow, fed by gossip and suspicion, and the tendency of isolated communities to turn any deviation from norm into a scandal. Hans heard the rumors within days of Friedrich's departure. Other men in the village, some perhaps genuinely concerned, others perhaps enjoying the chance to gossip and feel morally superior, told Hans that his wife had been seen behaving inappropriately with the traveling merchant, that she had smiled too much, talked too much, shown too much interest, that people were talking that Hans's reputation was being damaged, that he needed to do something to restore his honor and control his household. Hans was humiliated. His honor as a man in medieval village society depended entirely on his ability to control his wife, to ensure that she behaved with absolute propriety to maintain order in his household. The rumors suggested that he was a weak husband who could not manage his own wife, who allowed her freedoms that led to improper behavior. He was becoming a figure of mockery, the man whose wife smiled at traveling merchants. He had to act decisively and publicly to restore his reputation and demonstrate that he was master of his household. Hans went to the village council, an assembly of male landowners who met regularly to settle disputes and to enforce community standards. The council served as the local court for minor matters operating under customs that had developed over generations. Hans formally accused Alice of adultery with the traveling merchant Friedrich. He demanded that she be punished according to traditional law to restore his honor and to warn other women about the consequences of improper behavior. Alice was not present when these charges were brought. She was not informed that her husband had gone to the council. She had no idea that an accusation had been made until men came to her house the next day to drag her before the council. She was given no time to prepare, no opportunity to gather evidence or think about her defense. She was simply taken from her home, her children crying and confused as their mother was hauled away by village men. At the council meeting, Alice tried to defend herself. She insisted that she had only spoken briefly with Friedrich at the village well, that the conversations had been public and innocent, that nothing improper had occurred. She pointed out that she had never been alone with Friedrich, that other women had always been present, that she had only listened to his stories and asked a few questions. She begged the council to speak to the other women who had been at the well and who could confirm that nothing improper had happened. But the council was not interested in her defense. In their view, the evidence against her was overwhelming. Multiple witnesses had seen her talking to Friedrich on multiple occasions. Multiple witnesses testified that she had smiled and laughed with him, that she had shown obvious enjoyment of his company, that her behavior had been inappropriately friendly. This was sufficient for conviction under the customary law of that region and time. The standard was not proof of actual adultery, but simply behavior that could be interpreted as showing interest in another man because such interest itself was considered a form of betrayal, a violation of the absolute fidelity that wives owed their husbands. The council declared Alice guilty of adultery based on her suspicious behavior, even though there was no evidence of any physical impropriety. No claim that anyone had seen her alone with Friedrich, or touching him, or speaking inappropriately, no witnesses to anything more than public conversations at a village well. The fact that the evidence would not have been sufficient to convict anyone of anything in a modern court was irrelevant. In medieval village justice, the appearance of impropriety was as damnable as actual impropriety, and a woman's friendly behavior toward a man who was not her husband was proof enough of adultery. The council ordered that Alice be subjected to traditional German punishment for adulteresses, a set of rituals that had been practiced in that region for generations. She would be stripped naked, her head shaved completely, and paraded through the village while being whipped. Then she would be mutilated, her left ear cut off, and her forehead branded to mark her permanently so that everyone who saw her would know what she had done. This combination of public humiliation, physical pain, and permanent marking was designed to destroy Alice completely while providing a spectacular warning to every other woman in the village. Now, what I'm about to describe happened, and I need you to understand that this is documented, that this was normal practice in many parts of medieval Europe, that thousands of women went through variations of this punishment. On the appointed day, carefully chosen to be a market day when the village would be crowded with people from surrounding areas, village men came to Alice's home early in the morning. They dragged her from her house, despite her screams and protests. Her 3 young children watched crying hysterically as their mother was taken away. The oldest daughter, only 6 years old, tried to hold on to her mother's skirt, but one of the men roughly pushed the child away, sending her sprawling in the dirt. Alice was dragged to the village square, where a large crowd had already gathered. The entire village had turned out for this spectacle, and people from neighboring villages had come as well. Word having spread that an adulteress would be punished. Public punishment was entertainment in medieval society, a break from the tedium of daily life, a chance to see justice performed, and to feel morally superior by participating in the condemnation of a sinner. Alice was forced to stand in the center of the square, while the village headman read the charges against her in a loud voice. She was accused of adultery with the traveling merchant Friedrich based on her inappropriate behavior at the village, well based on multiple witnesses who testified to her excessive friendliness and interest in a man who was not her husband. Alice tried to protest, tried to explain that she had only spoken briefly with the merchant, that nothing improper had occurred, that the conversations had been public and innocent, but her protests were shouted down by the crowd, which jeered and called her liar and whore. Then the humiliation began. Alice was surrounded by several women who had been designated to strip her. These were not strangers, but women Alice had known for years, neighbors and acquaintances. They grabbed her clothing and began tearing it away roughly. Alice tried to resist, to hold on to her dress to preserve some modesty, but she was overpowered. Within minutes, she stood naked in the center of the square, exposed to the gaze of hundreds of people. The exposure was devastating for Alice, violating every norm of modesty that had been drilled into her since childhood. Medieval peasant women were taught that their bodies must always be covered, that exposure was shameful, that only a husband should see a wife's naked body. Now Alice stood naked before everyone she had ever known. Men, women, children, all staring at her, judging her body, seeing what should have been private. She tried to cover herself with her hands, but the men holding her pulled her arms away, forcing her to stand fully exposed, arms at her sides, while the crowd stared and made crude comments about her body. Her long hair, which she had never cut in her adult life, and which she wore in the braided style of married women, was next. A woman approached with sheep shears, the large scissors used for cutting wool from sheep, not designed for cutting human hair. The shearing was not done carefully or gently. The woman grabbed handfuls of Alice's hair and began cutting the dull shears, pulling and tearing rather than cutting cleanly. Alice could feel the shears yanking at her scalp, could feel strands of hair being pulled out by the roots when the blades failed to cut through. The woman worked her way around Alice's head, hacking away the long braids, letting the hair fall to the ground where it was trampled by the crowd. When most of the long hair was gone, she used the shears to cut as close to the scalp as possible, leaving Alice's head covered with uneven stubble. Then a man stepped forward with a razor, the same type used for shaving men's faces, and scraped away the remaining stubble, cutting so close to the scalp that he repeatedly nicked the skin. Blood ran down Alice's head and neck from dozens of small cuts. The shaving hurt, but more than the physical pain was the psychological impact of having this done to her, of being forcibly altered, of having her appearance and her identity literally cut away. Then, the parade began. Alice was forced to walk naked through every street of the village, driven forward by men with sticks, who poked and struck her if she tried to stop or slow down or cover herself. The route had been carefully planned to take her past every house, down every street, to ensure that every resident of the village witnessed her humiliation. A man followed directly behind her with a whip made of multiple leather strips, and he struck her across her back and legs every few steps, maintaining a steady rhythm of blows. The whip left red welts that quickly turned to bruises on Alice's skin. After the first several strikes, the whip began to break the skin, drawing blood that ran down her back and legs. Alice screamed with each blow, unable to maintain any dignity or composure, reduced to an animal-like state of pure suffering. The man wielding the whip showed no mercy, no variation in his rhythm, striking her again and again as she stumbled forward through the village streets. But the whipping was not the only violence Alice faced during the parade. The entire village participated. This was expected, required even. To refuse to participate would suggest sympathy for the adulteress, would mark one as potentially corrupt oneself. So everyone joined in. Women. Alice had known for years women she had worked alongside in the fields, women whose children played with her children. These women spat on her as she passed. They shouted insults, calling her whore and betrayer and devil's bride. Some of them threw things, handfuls of mud, animal waste, rotten vegetables that had been saved specifically for this purpose. The missiles struck Alice's naked body, covering her in filth, adding to her humiliation. Men threw stones, not large ones that might cause serious injury or death. The authorities did not want to kill her, but stones large enough to hurt when they struck. They hit Alice's arms and legs and back, adding bruises to the wounds from the whip. Some men made crude jokes about Alice's body, mocking her nakedness, making comments about her physical characteristics that reduced her to an object for their amusement. And the children, Alice's neighbors' children, who had played with her own children, they participated too. Their parents handed them rotten vegetables to throw, or showed them how to gather mud from the streets. The children threw their projectiles and laughed, learning through direct participation that this was appropriate treatment for women who violated community standards, internalizing the lessons about women's place and women's vulnerability that would shape their own behavior for the rest of their lives. The parade lasted for hours. The route wound through the village multiple times to ensure that everyone got multiple opportunities to witness Alice's humiliation and to participate in her punishment. By the time the parade finally ended back in the village square, Alice was barely recognizable as a human being. Her naked body was covered completely in mud-blood animal waste and the rotten vegetables that had been thrown at her. Her back and legs were torn open from the whipping, the flesh hanging in strips in some places. Her feet were bleeding from walking barefoot over rough ground and sharp stones. She was bruised from head to foot from the stones that had struck her. She collapsed in the square, unable to walk any further, her body simply giving up. She lay in the dirt, while the crowd continued to mock her, lying in her own blood, and the filth that covered her, too exhausted and too broken to move or to care any more what happened to her. But the punishment was not finished, and what happened next was designed to ensure that even if Alice somehow survived and recovered, she would never be able to escape what had been done to her. The village blacksmith was summoned, bringing his tools to the square. He had been instructed to carry out the mutilation in front of the assembled crowd to complete Alice's marking as part of the public spectacle. First, he would cut off Alice's left ear. Then he would brand her forehead with a hot iron, shaped like the letter H for Hure, the German word for whore. The ear cutting was not done cleanly or mercifully. The blacksmith was not a surgeon or a physician. His tools were not designed for precise cutting of human flesh. He had a knife that he normally used for cutting leather, and rope, a blade that was reasonably sharp, but not designed for medical procedures. He grabbed Alice's left ear, pulling it away from her head, and began sawing through it with the knife. The cutting was agonizing. The knife blade had to work through skin and cartilage and the complex structure of the ear, and the blacksmith had to saw back and forth because the cartilage was tougher than he expected. Alice screamed and struggled weakly, but she was held down by several men, her head pressed to the ground so she could not move. Blood poured from the wound, running down the side of her head and pooling on the ground beneath her. The blacksmith worked for what felt like an eternity, sawing through the ear until he finally managed to separate it completely from Alice's head. He dropped the severed ear onto the ground, where it was immediately trampled by the crowd pressing forward to see better. The wound left behind bled profusely, the side of Alice's head covered in blood that kept flowing no matter how she tried to press her hand against it. Then the blacksmith moved to the second part of the mutilation. He had a portable brazier that had been brought to the square for this purpose, filled with hot coals. An iron rod with the letter H shaped at one end had been heating in the coals during the parade and the ear cutting, and now it glowed red hot, ready for use. The blacksmith pulled the rod from the coals with tongs. He approached Alice where she lay on the ground, too weak and too broken to resist anymore. He pressed the glowing iron against Alice's forehead, right in the center above her eyebrows, where it would be visible to anyone who looked at her face. The smell of burning flesh filled the square. Alice's screams intensified to a pitch that seemed impossible for a human throat to produce, a sound of such pure agony that it made even some of the spectators turn away or cover their ears. The blacksmith held the iron in place for several seconds, ensuring the brand would be deep and permanent, then removed it. Alice's forehead now bore a clear H burned into the skin. The flesh charred and blistered blood and fluid oozing from the wound. She lost consciousness finally, her body and mind unable to take any more, shutting down to escape the unbearable reality of what was being done to her. Water was thrown on her face to revive her. She came to slowly disoriented, in more pain than she had known was possible. The crowd began to disperse, now that the spectacle was over, people heading home, or to the market discussing what they had witnessed, commenting on whether the punishment had been appropriate and sufficient, most agreeing that it had been a good lesson for the village's women. Alice was left lying in the square. No one helped her or offered any care. Eventually, hours later, she managed to crawl to the edge of the village and collapse in a ditch, too injured to move further. She lay there through the night, cold, and in agony from her injuries, drifting in and out of consciousness. When she finally made her way back to her house the next day, moving slowly, barely able to walk, she found that Hans had already gone. He had taken their 3 children, her daughters and her son, and had left for his brother's farm in another region. He had petitioned the local church court for an annulment of their marriage on grounds of adultery, and the annulment had been granted immediately based on Alice's conviction in the village court. The house had been stripped of everything valuable. Hans had taken his children to start a new life, away from the shame of having an adulterous wife, and he wanted no further connection to Alice. Alice was left completely alone. She had lost her husband, her children, her home, everything she had ever had. She was mutilated, unable to work, marked permanently as an adulteress. The brand on her forehead and her missing ear identified her immediately wherever she went, announcing to everyone what she had been convicted of, ensuring that she would never be able to escape or rebuild any kind of normal life. She tried to survive in the village for a few days, but people drove her away, refusing to give her food or shelter, telling her that her presence contaminated their community. She tried to find work in neighboring villages, walking from place to place despite her injuries, but everywhere she went, people saw her mutilations and understood what they meant. Some places she was driven away immediately with threats. Other places people stared and whispered, but no one would hire her or help her. She survived for several months by begging on the roads between settlements, sleeping in barns when she could find them, or under hedges when she could not, eating whatever scraps she could find or steal. But the injuries from her punishment never healed properly. The wound where her ear had been cut away became infected, the infection spreading into her skull, causing terrible headaches and fever. The brand on her forehead became badly infected from contamination and lack of treatment, the flesh around it swelling and turning green. In the winter, weakened by chronic infection and malnutrition, suffering from injuries that had never received any medical care, Alice developed a severe fever. She was found dead in a ditch beside a road between 2 small villages several days later by travelers who reported the body to the nearest town. The local authorities sent men to collect the corpse. She was buried in an unmarked grave in unconsecrated ground at the edge of the cemetery, the area reserved for criminals, beggars, and others deemed unworthy of Christian burial. Her death was recorded in the parish register simply as an adulterous woman found dead on the road near the village boundary. No name, no age, no mention of a family or children, no suggestion that she had ever been a person with a life and an identity beyond her conviction. Alice was 27 years old when she died. She left behind 3 children who grew up without their mother. Told only that their mother had been a bad woman who had sinned and been punished and who is not to be mentioned. The youngest, her son, was only 2 when she was taken away and had no memories of her at all. The older daughters remembered their mother, but were taught to be ashamed of her, to never speak of her, to consider her an example of what happened to bad women. And here's what makes Alice's story absolutely devastating and what you need to understand. The merchant Friedrich, when later questioned by traveling church officials who were conducting a routine inspection of local justice practices, testified under oath that he had never had any improper interaction with Alice beyond brief public conversations at the village well. He said that she had been completely proper in her behavior, that she had simply listened to his stories and asked a few questions, that nothing remotely resembling adultery or even flirtation had occurred. He expressed surprise and horror when told what had happened to her, saying that he had thought nothing of their conversations at the time. But by then, Alice was dead destroyed by an accusation based on nothing more than the fact that she had talked to a strange man and smiled and shown interest in stories about places she had never seen. Her crime, if it can even be called that, was being friendly to a traveler. That was sufficient for conviction, for torture, for mutilation, for being driven to death in a ditch. Alice's story shows how the mere appearance of impropriety, the smallest deviation from perfect modesty and absolute submission, the slightest display of personality or interest in anything beyond the narrow confines of home and husband, could destroy a woman's life completely in medieval Europe. Now I promised you that I would tell you what happened to Eleanor, the woman we met at the beginning of this story, the woman who was being sealed into a cell beneath a castle in 1379. And now that you understand what happened to Marjgery and Isabella, and Alice, now that you understand the range of punishments that medieval society used against accused adulteresses, you can understand what Eleanor's fate represents. Eleanor was sealed into that cell, the wall rising stone by stone, until it reached the ceiling, until there was no opening except a small gap at the top, barely large enough to pass through a cup and a piece of bread. She was left in complete darkness, unable to see anything, unable to tell day from night, unable to do anything except sit on the cold stone floor and wait. For the first days, Eleanor screamed. She begged to be released. She promised anything, everything, if only someone would break down the wall and let her out. She protested her innocence over and over, insisting that she had done nothing wrong, that the accusation was false, that this was unjust, but no one answered. No one came. The only sound was her own voice echoing off stone walls. After about a week, the screaming stopped. Not because Eleanor had been released, or because the situation had improved, but because she no longer had the strength to scream. She had been given minimal food and water through the small opening, just enough to keep her alive, but not enough to maintain her strength. She spent most of her time lying on the floor, too weak to move, drifting in and out of consciousness. According to the records that survived, because yes, this was documented, this was recorded in the castle's accounts as an expense for the masons and for the minimal food provided. Eleanor survived in that sealed cell for 42 days before she died. 42 days in complete darkness. 42 days with barely any food or water, or 42 days unable to stand or move or see anything or hear anything except her own breathing and heartbeat. 42 days going slowly mad from the isolation and the darkness and the knowledge that she had been buried alive and that she would die here and that no one would help her. When she finally died, the wall was torn down and her body was removed. She was buried without ceremony in the castle grounds. The cell was sealed permanently. The entire incident treated as a private family matter that did not need to be discussed publicly. Eleanor's family was told that she had died of an illness. They were not told the truth about what had been done to her. Eleanor's crime. She'd been accused by her husband of having an affair with a visiting nobleman. The evidence was that they had been seen talking privately in a castle corridor. That was all. A conversation. But her husband, wanting to be rid of a wife he had grown tired of, used the accusation to dispose of her permanently in a way that avoided scandal and that ensured she could never return to trouble him or to tell anyone what had been done to her. This is what medieval Europe did to women accused of adultery. This is what happened when societies organized themselves around absolute male authority. When women were considered property, when honor was valued more than truth or justice or human life. Marjgery branded and ducked until she died in a ditch. Isabella locked in a convent cell for 23 years. Alice mutilated and driven to death on the roads. Eleanor sealed alive into a stone tomb beneath a castle. And thousands upon thousands of other women whose names we do not know, whose stories were not recorded, who suffered and died under a system designed to destroy them. What do you think about this history? How should we remember these women and what was done to them? Leave your comments below. And if you believe this history needs to be told, that we need to understand how gender-based violence has been systematically used throughout history to control women, then subscribe to this channel and share this video. Hit that subscribe button right now. The medieval buildings still stand throughout Europe. Tourists visit them every day. But in those squares, women were branded and mutilated. In those convents, women were imprisoned for decades. In those castles, women were sealed into cells and left to die. The stones remember even if we have forgotten. Remember Marjgery. Remember Isabella. Remember Alice. Remember Eleanor. Remember all the women whose names we do not know. They were people. They suffered. They existed. See you in the next video.